Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, in 1896 was a place where the past still clung like ivy on stone walls. The war had ended more than 30 years earlier, but the echoes of cannon fire and the cries of men never seemed to fade. Trains now cut through the valley, their whistles piercing the mist, and the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers still met like restless spirits at the town's edge. Locals knew everyone by name, or thought they did. But in this quiet town, strangers always passed through. Some stayed for supper, some for a night's rest, and some were never seen again. At the end of Washington Street stood the Whitlow House, a large boarding house with whitewashed walls, green shutters, and a crooked chimney that sent smoke curling into the sky. Its windows glowed warmly each evening, drawing in drifters, railway workers, and the occasional weary traveler. To most, it was a refuge. To others, it was a place they avoided after dark. Clara and Margaret Whitlow had inherited the house from their father, a stern iron worker who had died during the war. Clara, the elder, was 40, with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed to weigh every person who crossed her path. She was practical, firm, and unyielding, the kind of woman who carried burdens without complaint. Margaret, a few years younger, was her opposite. She had a soft voice, round cheeks, and a smile that lingered even when her hands were cracked from scrubbing floors or stirring stew. Townsfolk often said she had a way of making a man feel seen, even if only for a fleeting moment. Together, the sisters ran the boarding house. Their reputation for hearty meals was unmatched: chicken stew thick with potatoes and carrots, cornbread still warm from the oven, and blackberry preserves that tasted of summer itself. Hungry travelers spread word of their table far beyond Harpers Ferry. But no one ever asked how two women, with no farm and no husband, always had so much to serve. The Whitlow dining room was always full. A long oak table stretched across the room, set with mismatched plates, tin cups, and oil lamps that flickered in the evening shadows. Guests often marveled at the meals. "This stew," one railroad worker once said, smacking his lips, "it's got something in it. Tastes like it's been cooking since the dawn of time." Margaret smiled, ladling another portion into his bowl. "It's love, sir. Food tastes best when stirred with care." Clara, standing at the head of the table, rarely smiled. She watched her guests carefully, her eyes flicking from face to face. When a man reached for more bread than his share, she noted it. When another spoke harshly to Margaret, her lips pressed into a thin line. Most guests ate quickly and left, thankful. But now and then, one stayed longer, asking too many questions, or taking too much. And that, Clara believed, was when supper became something more than food. By summer's end, whispers drifted through town. A traveling peddler had last been seen carrying his bag of trinkets up the Whitlow porch. A railway worker never made it back to his crew after a night there. A pair of drifters were rumored to have shared supper at the sisters' table, and then disappeared without a trace. Some blamed bandits along the river road, others muttered of accidents on the cliffs, but a few, lowering their voices, said the Whitlow house had secrets. They pointed at the smoke that rose late at night, at the way Clara never explained her endless supplies of meat. When asked directly, Clara replied coldly, "Men come and men go. That is the way of the world." Margaret, however, could not hide the tremor in her voice. "Perhaps they found better fortune elsewhere," she suggested, but her words rang hollow. Margaret began to change. She moved slower in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she stirred the stew. At the table, she pushed food around her plate instead of eating. Her once bright laughter faded into silence. Late one evening, as the lanterns dimmed, Clara noticed her sister staring into her bowl. "You're weakening," Clara said sharply. Margaret lifted her eyes, wet with unshed tears. "I'm not weak, Clara. I'm haunted." Clara's voice hardened. "Don't let your heart betray us. We do what must be done." Margaret bit her lip, her voice breaking. "And what of their families, Clara?" Do you ever think of the children waiting for fathers who will never return? Clara turned away. The world is cruel, sister. We cannot be tender when it devours the tender first. Clara carried bitterness like a shield. She had been old enough to remember the war, the smoke, the soldiers marching through, the bodies in the street. Their father had been taken by war, their mother by fever, leaving the sisters to fend for themselves. Clara believed men were wolves, no matter how they smiled. She judged them not by their words, but by their hunger, their greed, their cruelty. To her, the boarding house was not just shelter. It was a courtroom, and supper was the trial. Margaret tried to pray at night, whispering for forgiveness, but Clara prayed for strength to keep doing what she believed was necessary. One October evening, a storm rolled in. Rain lashed the shutters, thunder rattled the windows. Through the downpour came a figure in a gray coat, drenched and weary. "Evening, ma'ams," he said, tipping his hat. "Name's Elias Turner. I'm a schoolteacher on my way to Maryland." His voice was gentle, carrying no demand, only gratitude. Margaret welcomed him in, fussing over his soaked coat. Clara stood in the corner, her sharp eyes narrowing. "A teacher, you say?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Elias replied with a smile. "Letters and numbers to little ones who'd otherwise have none." Something in his tone disarmed Margaret instantly, but to Clara, it felt like a practiced charm. That night, supper was laid as always. Elias joined the table, bowing his head in thanks before eating. Between mouthfuls, he told stories of children learning their first words, of villages where books were treasures, of the hope he carried in ink and paper. Margaret's eyes lit up. She laughed again, truly laughed, for the first time in months. She served Elias extra cornbread, her hand steady for once. Clara, however, watched in silence. She studied Elias's face, his manner, his every word. She tapped her knife against the table as though keeping time with her suspicion. To her, men who seemed too good often hid the deepest rot. That night, when the lamps were blown out and the house fell quiet, Clara paced the hallway. The storm outside had passed, but a storm within her brewed stronger. Margaret found her by the window. "You're thinking of him," she said softly. Clara's jaw tightened. "We cannot choose who deserves mercy. All men are the same when stripped of charm." Margaret shook her head, her voice urgent. "No, Clara. He's different. He's good. I can feel it." Clara turned sharply, her voice like ice. "Feelings are for fools. Have you forgotten what good men did to us? To this town?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Then let me be a fool, if it means sparing one's soul." The next morning, as Elias prepared for bed after his long journey, a folded paper slipped from his coat pocket. Margaret picked it up, intending to return it, but curiosity caught her. It was a letter, written in a child's uneven hand. "Papa, come home soon. Mama says you'll bring stories. I miss you." Margaret's throat tightened. Elias was not a drifter, not a thief, not a wolf in disguise. He was a father, returning to a child who waited for his embrace. She clutched the letter to her chest, whispering to herself, "I won't let him be taken." Margaret's hand shook as she folded Elias's letter back into its envelope. She couldn't shake the image of a small child sitting by a window, waiting for her father's return. That night, by the fire, she finally confronted Clara. "He has a family, Clara. A little one who waits for him. If you take him, you don't just end a life. You shatter two more." Clara's eyes flashed. And how many little ones watched fathers march off to war and never return? How many good men burned our fields, stole our food, left us to starve? Margaret's voice broke into a sob. "Not him. He's not those men. He carries books, not rifles. He brings hope, not ruin." Clara slammed her hand against the table. "Hope is a luxury, Margaret. We cannot gamble our safety on the smile of a stranger." The rift between them widened like a crack in the foundation of their house. threatening to break everything they had built together. Dawn crept through lace curtains, painting the wooden floor in gold. Elias rose early, thanking the sisters for their kindness. His smile was soft, his gratitude genuine. Margaret handed him the letter she had guarded through the night. "This belongs to you," she said, her eyes brimming with meaning he didn't fully grasp. Elias pressed the letter to his chest. "Ah, yes, my little girl wrote that. Thank you kindly." Clara stood in the doorway, her hands folded tightly around the edge of her apron, the kitchen knife glinting on the counter beside her. For a long moment, the room froze, the clatter of the outside world distant and muffled. But Margaret stepped forward, her body between Clara and Elias. "Safe travels, sir," she said firmly. Elias tipped his hat, bowed slightly, and stepped out into the morning light. His gray coat disappeared down the muddy road, leaving silence in his wake. The moment the door shut, Clara erupted. "You've doomed us!" she hissed, her face pale with rage. Margaret stood her ground. "No, Clara. You've doomed yourself if you keep feeding vengeance instead of mercy." Clara's chest rose and fell sharply. "You don't understand. One man spared becomes 10 who betray. He will talk, Margaret. They will come. And when they do, it will not be me they hang. It will be us both." Margaret's tears streamed freely now, but her voice carried steel. "Then let it be so. I will not have his blood, or any more blood, on my hands." For the first time, Clara felt her authority slipping. The younger sister she once thought fragile now stood taller than her in conviction. 3 days later, a deputy knocked at the Whitlow door. His uniform was damp from drizzle, his boots muddy. "Afternoon, Miss Whitlow," he said, tipping his hat. "We've been asking about some missing travelers. Your house comes up often." Clara's gaze was sharp, her answers clipped. "We run a boarding house. Men come and men go. That's no crime." But Margaret, sitting near the fire, couldn't help her gentler tone. "We had a school teacher, Mr. Elias Turner. He left here safely, I assure you." The deputy nodded. "We heard the same. He reached Maryland, wrote to the station master, in fact, spoke highly of you ladies." He smiled faintly, as though relieved. Margaret let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Clara, however, sat rigid, her face unreadable. Though Elias's safe passage cleared them of suspicion for the moment, the town's whispers didn't stop. Too many others had gone missing. At church, women leaned close and murmured. "They've always food aplenty, haven't they?" one said. "And never a farm to speak of," another replied. Children dared each other to run past the Whitlow house at dusk, squealing that ghosts of the missing men lurked in the cellar. The sisters felt the weight of every sideways glance, every whisper that followed them down Washington Street. For Clara, it hardened her resolve. For Margaret, it deepened her shame. Margaret refused to be silent any longer. She began preparing meals with what little money she had set aside. Simple dishes of beans, bread, and garden herbs. No longer would she touch the meats Clara brought from the cellar. When boarders came, Margaret sang softly while she cooked, filling the kitchen with warmth Clara hadn't heard in years. The guests ate, laughed, and lingered. For once, the house seemed alive with something other than shadows. One evening, Margaret told Clara flatly, "This house can heal, Clara. It doesn't have to be a place of judgment. Let them eat, let them rest, and let them go." Clara scoffed, but even she could feel the change. The laughter unsettled her. She had grown so used to silence. Alone by the fire one night, Clara stared at her untouched meal. She thought she heard voices in the crackling wood, whispers that clawed at her mind. "You judged us. You ended us." Was mercy not enough? She closed her eyes, but faces rose from memory. The peddler, the drifters, the railway man. Their eyes were wide, accusing. From the kitchen came the sound of Margaret humming, her laughter mingling with that of the boarders. The contrast was unbearable. Clara pressed her hands over her ears, but the ghosts within were louder still. For the first time, Clara felt the gnaw of doubt. Had she been protecting her sister or condemning her? Winter winds rattled the shutters when a postman arrived with a letter addressed to Margaret. The handwriting was neat, the envelope worn from travel. Inside was a message from Elias Turner. Miss Whitlow, I pray this finds you well. I arrived safely and was welcomed home by my little girl's arms around my neck. She speaks of you, though she's never met you, for I told her of your kindness. If ever you doubt your worth, remember this. You saved not only my life, but the light in her eyes. For that, I am forever in your debt. Margaret's tears fell onto the page. She read the letter aloud by the fire, her voice trembling. Clara sat quietly across from her, saying nothing, her eyes fixed on the flames. That night, Clara finally spoke. Her voice was lower than Margaret had ever heard it. I thought I was protecting us, she whispered. I thought every man who crossed our threshold was a wolf, waiting to bare his teeth. But I see now. I was feeding my anger, not our safety. Margaret reached across the table, taking her sister's rough hand. You've carried so much pain, Clara. But pain doesn't have to be the end of our story. Clara's lips trembled. You saved him, Margaret. And perhaps, in doing so, you've saved me too. The firelight flickered against her face, softening the hard lines carved by years of bitterness. The Whitlow house never completely shed its shadows. Rumors of missing men lingered, told in hushed tones around campfires and churchyards. Some said the sisters' stew had once been laced with more than carrots. Others swore ghosts still haunted their cellar. But for travelers who came after, the house was remembered differently. They spoke of two sisters, one stern, one gentle, who served warm meals and offered beds to the weary. They remembered Margaret's singing, the crackling fire, the bread that tasted like kindness itself. In the end, it wasn't the stew or cornbread that lingered in memory. It was the truth that even in a place long ruled by vengeance, mercy found a seat at the table. And that mercy, given to one weary schoolteacher on a stormy night, changed the course of two sisters' lives forever.